Hi, my name's Alec, and I would like to talk about DNS over HTTPS over Tor. This presentation was originally given at NDSS in February 2021. I've made some amendments to it since then, and this is SDNS in August 21, and so I've put any changes and amendments in blue for clarity. I would like to basically work backwards and say that my partner and I have been exclusively or almost exclusively using DNS over HTTPS over Tor at home for the past 18 months. It works fine. In fact, it worked so well that I set it up in February 2020 and forgot about it because that's when the pandemic broke out, that's when lockdown happened, and there was an awful lot of personal stuff that I had to deal with. And I rediscovered it in July 2020, at which point I started to take it seriously. Because everything that I had read previously about doing DNS over Tor had set me up to believe that I would have a terrible experience, that it would be slow, that it would be flaky, requests would fail all the time, and so forth. All of this prejudice is wrong. It turns out that you can make a stable, private, secure, reliable and acceptable DNS resolution service over Tor, giving you a high degree of privacy, a high degree of anonymity and freedom from tracking. And the performance is acceptable. That my measurements say, in fact, I can show, over the course of 2.4 million requests, the median latency for responses was 260 odd milliseconds if I allow for caching and 460 milliseconds if I don't cache. And that's out of a set of 2.4 million requests, 1.6 million of which were not cached. These are important numbers to put on the record because some people, normal people, live with worse performance than this day in, day out, some of whom do so by choice. In order to get a snapshot of broad DNS resolution experience, I wrote some shell scripts. The reason I wrote the shell scripts is that most of the DNS performance measurement tooling is all about minimum latency. What's the fastest speed that you can squeeze out of your DNS infrastructure? I wanted instead to get a snapshot of many requests, how long did it take to serve them all. So I wrote a shell script that did 100 lookups of random IPv4 addresses backwards, did dig -x on them. It was a very unscientific, very basic test. But the goal was to get a sense of how long it took to do, what's the mean amount of time to do 5 banks of 100 resolution requests. And running DNS over HTTPS over Tor came in at about the 70th percentile. A lot of people did better than it in terms of performance, but quite a lot of people did worse, and it's not an embarrassingly slow solution. The reason for this is that some people trade latency in order to obtain value. For instance, a lot of the people who were running this test and had slower results than DNS over HTTPS over Tor were running Pi-hole. They were running a client, a stub resolver, on their premises or at home in order to protect them from adverts, from tracking and cookies and other things like that. Some Pi-holes ran faster, some Pi-holes ran slower, but still running DNS over HTTPS over Tor was viable and pretty much boring. The lesson that I take from this is that arguing about single-digit latency, 5 milliseconds versus 50 versus 500, is somewhat presumptuous of us. It is a privileged position, especially driving that number down to the single-digit latency figures, to single-digit resolution figures, tends to assume that you've got great connections to the backbone, that you are on a really fast link, all of this stuff, which doesn't scale to the rest of the world and certainly it is not obligatory for people who want privacy. Latency is not everything. It's only a fraction of the user experience, a fraction of the DNS value proposition, but it's one that's really easy to measure, and we tend to get hung up on it. If you agree with this, why not take latency as a budget and use that budget to pursue better privacy? And this is where we come to DNS over HTTPS over Tor. Now, if we want to talk about the security of this proposition, we need to make some basic assumptions. And the ones that I've made are that an ISP will typically, if they do it at all, do blocking of IP addresses as a tuple of IP address and port, or possibly as a negative tuple. So, for instance, DNS might be blocked to port 53 to hosts which are other than some approved DNS resolver. HTTP is unlikely to suffer that kind of wildcard blocking because it is the fundamental means by which we do web communication. And so it needs to be open so that port 443, once the connection is approved, can be accessed anywhere on almost any IP address. We're also going to assume that Tor is globally hard to surveil and is resistant to block collusion or subpoena, and that HTTPS certificates work in order to provide us both with privacy and integrity and identity assurance of the web server, in this case the DOH server that we're connecting to prove that the identity is valid. Doing DNS over HTTPS over Tor was designed to address a threat model where an actor may surveil my network links, block my queries, tamper with the queries, block responses, tamper with the responses, or pretend to be proxies or resolvers that I might be using in the DNS resolution path. Their goal is to learn that my identity is or was previously associated with some query that was made. And in addition to these standard threats, they may also be able to surveil around a resolver, both on the front end and back end, in order to do some sort of correlation analysis, or they may be able to subpoena logs or collude with resolvers and proxies in order to get the information that might allow them to learn my identity. So this is the whole threat model which I am trying to address in this solution. We have a selection of protocols available to us to perform DNS resolution. Firstly, there's DNS over port 53 UDP. It's terribly insecure, but somehow it's still ubiquitous, and it provides us with no integrity nor any privacy. DNS over TLS improves this a little bit, but it's still subject to, for instance, port blocking, so that a client may be forbidden from accessing anything other than an approved DNS resolver, which is in itself a concern for integrity and client choice. It's also still possible to have second-party and third-party surveillance or collusion in order to work out what the user was looking up. DNS over HTTPS improves the matter a bit. Port blocking is unlikely because HTTPS port 443 is unlikely to be blocked for general access on the internet, but it still suffers from third-party surveillance, collusions, even second-party surveillance. There are a couple of new protocols being developed, part of being researched at the moment, which are the Oblivious DNS and Oblivious DOH protocols, which still have third-party surveillance, maybe port blocks and collusion available, and they require someone who understands the risks that they are still taking by using it. And then DNS over HTTPS over Tor risks arguably none of the above unless Tor is somehow fundamentally broken. The most interesting things to compare against at the moment are the Oblivious protocols, because they are like inserting a single layer of Tor anonymizing proxies into the stack between client and resolver. The people who are designing these protocols seem to have made choices, again, to primarily minimize latency impact, and latency is something that I don't concern myself too much with. They are building protocols which still risk selective IP blocking. For instance, a small tier of anonymizing proxies might be blocked by Russia or Iran, compared to a larger community of Tor bridges and of proxies and all of the extra capability that Tor has for client communication. Also, if you have only a single tier of anonymizing proxy, it enables both sides surveillance, synthetic collusion, where a suitably equipped actor can see what's going upstream, what's coming downstream, and correlate the two in order to work out what queries and responses were being made by the client at the initiating end. there's also the fundamental question of who runs these single-tier anonymizing proxies. Is it a separate organization to the one that is doing your DNS resolution, or do somehow all of the queries and logs all wind up logged together in a single infrastructure? It does require actual thought and understanding for these to be utilized by users, and that's hard and expensive to provide for users. It's a complicated concept to get across, whereas Tor obviates it by design. So, consequently, if you want strong DNS privacy, then you should deploy DNS over HTTPS over Tor. It's free, it exists, you don't need any new tools. It uses DNS crypt proxy in order to do all of the stub resolution. The user, you are the person in control, and you can roll your own. It's an operational practice rather than a brand new protocol. There might be some interesting research questions about cache tuning and other stuff like that, but I'm not going to worry about those too much. Those can be left to academics who want to. My argument is that if the performance of this solution is on par with Pi-hole, then there are already privacy-centric communities who would value it as a solution. So let's look at the architecture, because it's really, really simple. I took a copy of DNS crypt proxy and set it up as a stub resolver. I set it up as a port 53 DNS service on my local LAN as the only one, and I blocked outgoing port 53 at my firewall so that only the DOHOT server, DOHOT server, could be accessed to do DNS resolution. I then configured DNS crypt proxy to make all resolution requests over Tor. This also has the benefit of having it minimize fingerprintable data. All of the HTTP requests that it makes have got the same headers. There are no cookies. There are no browser fingerprints or anything like that, which could be used to give away identity. And then I take it and configure a set load balanced pool of DOH servers into DNS crypt proxy. As of August 2021, that means that there's about 62 DOH servers from 36 distinct providers, thereabouts, including IPv6 equipped providers, because Tor can talk IPv6 now. And there are filters in the DNS crypt proxy config file to require that the DOH servers provide DNSSEC and promise that they provide or offer no filtration. That's it. So it's very simply that the client talks to the stub resolver DNS crypt proxy, which uses Tor to talk to a load balanced pool of DNS over HTTPS servers. It is that easy. Tor provides the anonymity. HTTPS load balancing mitigates the Tor lag and the server lag that you might get through an excessively long Tor circuit. It uses off-the-shelf software, and the performance is acceptable in the order of, as I said earlier, 260 or so milliseconds, or 460 if you don't have caching, and it's comparable in latency to Pi-hole. So if you've got this solution, if you can address the entire threat model that I outlined earlier within a reasonable latency budget, why address a mere subset of it? Why would you not want to get all of the security, squeeze all of the privacy that you could do out of this solution? Well, in the DNS privacy community and the DNS community overall, this is a very hot topic. Some people believe that we should solve privacy centrally, not on the client side, but this seems strange because DNS is a distributed protocol, and shouldn't a distributed protocol require the clients to own the concept of privacy and integrity? Or they say that you should solve this problem for everyone, so what we need is a privacy solution that scales, and this is why there is research into the oblivious protocols. But then this revolts against needs-based solutions like Tor, which can focus better privacy upon people who really require it. There are some folks saying that, or arguing against all of this research on the basis that if DNS goes wholly dark so that you cannot attribute resolution requests to individuals, then authorities might lock down the protocols or ban certain forms of anonymous DNS. That is a risk, but I think it's one that we should pursue because the capabilities of democratic states today to interfere with or surveil DNS are what totalitarian states and despots will do to DNS tomorrow. And I would like instead to defend other people who may be facing that risk. There's also, if you want to critique DNS over HTTPS over Tor generally, you could say that the threat model is unrealistic, in which case I'd like to know what you are not defending against, choosing not to defend against, and why. And also, you could also criticize the statistics that I've created, the metrics that I have measured in the last 18 months or so. If so, you're welcome to generate your own. I would love to see more people attempt this and try it for themselves and I believe, prove to themselves that it works. Let's go out and do some research. It would be a great thing for other people to adopt this. I would love to see more results rather than just my own. A final little update from August 2021. I finally had two problems that are sort of attributable to DOHOT. One was that in June 2021, I had about half an hour where the Google connectivity check system failed to resolve. One of my DOH servers was giving me bogus IP addresses, apparently in China, and they were unreachable for reasons I do not understand. And then also in July 2021, I purchased a single and solitary IoT device that fails to connect when I was setting it up. It turned out that it is hard-coded for some reason to access 8.8.8.8 for all DNS queries, and that required whitelisting. Aside from that, everything that I do using DNS over HTTPS over Tor works just fine. I would like to leave you, though, with one slide, and this is the most key message that I'd like to come out of this entire presentation, which is DNS latency is not a cost. It is a cost if you are a provider, but hopefully if you're listening to this, you are not a provider. You are a consumer or a user, and you should look at it in terms of a budget that you're willing to accept, and in that budget, what value can you extract? And I believe that the value you can get out of this is better privacy and better integrity with less tracking and less interference. This is the URL for DNS over HTTPS over Tor. Please visit and let me know what you think. Oh, cool. So yes, did I notice any blocking or rate limiting issues egressing from the Tor network? And the answer is not that I'm aware of, but that may have been lost in the noise of load balancing, because when you were looking at 5 or 40 or something like that, separate DOH servers, and they're all being accessed separately with different circuits and so forth, you are less likely to have any single choke point impacting you. Going back to the questions list, there's also an interesting question from Jan, I think, saying, to argue that 50 versus 500 milliseconds delay ought to be acceptable from a human experience perspective, wants to push back and say this is an infrastructural delay, and baking this delay into user experience fundamentally limits how far you can scale. I think I can see what's being said here, and the question I always have to this is, who is you in this context in terms of you can scale? Are you a app vendor or a software vendor or maybe a gaming platform saying, yes, all of our gamers need to have single-digit millisecond DNS resolution in order to play? That seems pretty unlikely. The point of scaling, people who are focusing about the scale issues tend to be coming at it from a sort of service-centric perspective rather than the distributed client-centric, user-centric experience of fairly minor DNS latency. As I say, it's like, as I measured it, it was in the order of the 70th percentile. There were friends of mine in Ireland, in Greece, in Russia, who were having a much worse, much more laggy experience of doing DNS resolution moment to moment than I was. And of course, caching always helps. So I've found it to be very positive and very usable. No downsides apart from the odd glitch which I described in the presentation. Do we have any other questions? Pop back over to cherry picking. Could DNS crypt over any VPN, not just Tor, give the same level of privacy? That's a great question. I imagine DNS crypt over Tor would probably solve much the same issues here. DNS over any VPN, possibly, Possibly, because that would be giving you some armor plating to obfuscate your traffic over the last mile, first mile link to your ISP or whomever. I'd still be a little bit worried about correlation attacks imposed by the VPN, who has a single and quite godlike viewpoint of it is this IP address and this customer who is making that query to such and such a DNS service over there. So it would certainly have to be DNS crypt and load balance to multiple services in order to add more noise. I just find that the Tor 3-hop thing, having 3 tiers of anonymization, as it were, or three tiers of proxies, adds greater anonymity. In fact, thinking about Ian's question again, what he's talking about here in some respects is a little bit like Oblivious DOH, in that you've got a single tier of hiding. The 3 tiers that you get from Tor are a little bit better from the perspectives of anonymity, and I look forward to seeing the next presentation about Oblivious DOH to see whether there's been any movement in the single tier which they have been previously discussing. Going back over to the questions. I might trust a VPN in Switzerland, protected by local laws. Switzerland's a lovely country. You are increasing the statistical likelihood that you can be decloaked over time by preferring latency or making redundant queries. This is true, that there's a saying in the Tor community that anonymity loves company. And so what would be the best thing for this solution overall would be broader acceptance and broader use of it. Because the joy of DNS crypt, especially when it's configured sensibly, is that it minimizes the fingerprinting that's associated with any given query, and it removes browser cookies, and it removes any other sort of browser-related identifiers. So if we could say that all queries look practically identical from any number of people, the mixture of requests would make it extremely hard to de-anonymize. It's not impossible, of course, but it's still, I would aver, a lot better than all of the, or a lot more robust, perhaps, than most, if not all, of the other solutions which are in offer. And it pre-exists. Like, I have done nothing here. I have invented nothing. This has all been invented by people who are much cleverer and more dedicated than I. But when you combine these great things together, you wind up with a very secure DNS resolution service.